A coffin sits in a field outside Beijing. It has been sitting there for 37 years. No one will bury it. No one can. Because the woman inside left one final instruction, and it broke the entire system. Her name was Bumbutai. She guided 3 emperors. She held the Qing Dynasty together for 27 years. And when she died in January 1688, at the age of 75, she said one thing: "Do not bury me with my husband." She said it was because she couldn't bear to leave her children and grandchildren. She wanted to rest near her son's tomb instead, not beside the man she'd married more than 60 years earlier. It sounded like a grandmother's love. But for 300 years, historians have been asking the same question. Was she staying close to her son? Or was she refusing to go back to a marriage she had already betrayed? To understand why that coffin had nowhere to go, you have to go back to 1625. She was 13. She was sent to a man's bed, and her aunt was already in it. Bumbutai came from the Korchin Mongols, a tribe that survived by marrying its women into power. Her aunt had already been given to a warlord named Hong Taiji, the man building what would become the Qing Dynasty. In 1625, 13-year-old Bumbutai was sent to join her. Her brother escorted her to the capital. The Grand Khan himself, Hong Taiji's father, rode out 10 miles with his princes to welcome her. That ceremony wasn't for the bride. It was for the alliance her body represented. 9 years later, her older sister was shipped in too. Same husband, higher rank. When Hong Taiji declared himself emperor in 1636, the pecking order became official. Their aunt was empress. Her sister was the most beloved consort, ranked second. Bumbutai was fifth, dead last. 3 generations of women from one family, married to the same man. This was a political safety net woven from women's bodies. Bumbutai was the least important knot. Hong Taiji was obsessed with her sister. When her sister died, he nearly collapsed from grief. Bumbutai watched all of this. She learned early. Being loved was luck, and luck runs out. She needed something else. In 1638, she gave birth to a son, the 9th prince, Fulin. He would become the only card she ever needed to play. In 1643, Hong Taiji dropped dead without warning. No will, no named successor. A vacuum opened, and 2 men lunged for the throne. Huge, the eldest prince, had troops. Hong Taiji's younger brother, a brilliant general named Dorgon, and Bumbutai's own brother-in-law, had just as many. Bumbutai did something no one expected. She pushed her 6-year-old son into the gap. Fulin was perfect, not because he was strong, but because he was nothing. Too young to threaten anyone, too royal to refuse. Picking him meant neither side had to lose face, and neither side had to draw a sword. It worked. Fulin became emperor. Dorgon became regent. Bumbutai had won. But the price was this. From that moment on, her fate was locked to her dead husband's younger brother. A widow, a regent, and a 6-year-old on the throne. The triangle that would define and possibly destroy her reputation for the next 4 centuries. In 1644, the Qing armies swept through the Great Wall and took Beijing. Bumbutai moved into the Forbidden City. So did Dorgon. His titles started inflating. First, Imperial Uncle Regent. Then a small change, 1 word, 3 centuries of debate. He became the Imperial Father Regent, uncle to father. What did that mean? One scholar found that in the original Manchu documents, the word was esije, a term of respect for an elder, closer to patriarch than dad. The Chinese translation rendered it as Imperial Father, and the ambiguity took on a life of its own. But then there's the other evidence. During the last years of the Qing Dynasty, a government archive collapsed. Officials sorting through the rubble claimed they found a document, an imperial decree announcing the Empress Dowager's marriage to the Imperial Father Regent. If that document was real, Imperial Father wasn't a translation error. It was literal. He married the Emperor's mother. And there's this. The young Emperor himself wrote that his mother had been forced to live separately from him. Months would pass between visits. Dorgon had split them apart. Around 1651, a poet from the defeated Qing Dynasty wrote a mocking verse. Great ceremony, the Empress Dowager's wedding. Enemy propaganda, eyewitness record. Nobody knows. Every fragment points the same direction. A widow and her brother-in-law behind the walls of the Forbidden City, sharing something that no one could publicly name. In December 1650, Dorgon died suddenly. He was 39. 2 months later, the teenage emperor, now 14, ordered his uncle's grave torn open. The body was dragged out and whipped. Every title, every honor stripped. This was a boy settling a score with the man who had controlled his entire childhood. But it was also the cruelest possible test of his mother. Think about it. If there had been nothing between Bumbutai and Dorgon, she could have openly backed her son's decision. If there had been something, she had even more reason to speak, to defend herself, to grieve, to explain. She did neither. She said nothing. From 1650 until her death in 1688, 38 years, she never uttered a single recorded word about Dorgon. That silence is the loudest thing in her entire biography. It proves nothing. It disproves nothing. Here's what makes it even more complicated. Dorgon himself had married the widow of the eldest prince, his own nephew's wife. This was levirate marriage, an old Manchu custom, where a surviving brother inherits his dead relative's widow. Hong Taiji had formally banned the practice. Dorgon did it anyway. If a brother-in-law marrying a widow was thinkable in that world, even after it was banned, then whatever happened between Bumbutai and Dorgon may not have been the scandal later Chinese culture made it. So why was everyone so determined to bury it? After Dorgon, Bumbutai lived another 38 years. She put an 8-year-old grandson on the throne. She engineered alliances to neutralize a power-hungry minister named Oboy. She helped that grandson, the Kangxi emperor, grow into one of the longest reigning rulers in Chinese history, crushing a massive rebellion that nearly split the empire apart. She spent 35 years in the Palace of Compassion and Tranquility. In 1685, she suffered a stroke. Her right hand curled inward, her speech blurred. She summoned 48 Tibetan Buddhist monks to chant in the palace gardens and treated herself with Tibetan medicine. 3 years later, in January 1688, she spoke her last words to her grandson. Your grandfather has rested in peace for so long. Do not disturb his tomb for my sake. My heart cannot leave you and your father. Bury me near your father's mausoleum. Then I will have no regrets. One sentence. It accomplished 3 things at once. It refused reunion with her husband. It declared love for her descendants. And it gave a reason no one could argue with. But it also created an impossible problem. No Qing empress had ever been buried apart from her husband. The Kangxi emperor couldn't defy his grandmother's dying wish. He also couldn't set the precedent. So the coffin just stayed. For 37 years, in a temporary shelter beside her son's tomb, until the next emperor finally built a mausoleum on the spot. In 1725. That tomb sits inside the Great Wall. Her husband's tomb is hundreds of miles away in Manchuria. She and Hong Taiji are separated forever. Picture that coffin again. Inside it, a 13-year-old girl traded to a stranger's bed. A consort ranked dead last. A mother who gambled her 6-year-old son for a throne. A widow bound to her brother-in-law by something no archive can fully explain. A woman who kept silent for 38 years. Her last words were, "My heart cannot leave my children." Maybe that was the truth. Maybe it was her final masterpiece. Motherly love as the perfect seal over a question she never intended anyone to answer. In 1989, a television director tried to include her remarriage to Dorgon in a drama. A political official filed a formal complaint. Distortion and slander of the Manchu people. The scene was cut. 300 years later, her silence still holds.